Hello. In the next 20 minutes or so, I want to give you a brief overview of some of the main ideas that we are working with in our book, Plantation Life. So beginning with the question of what is a plantation? At some point in our collaboration, Pujo and I asked ourselves how we would define a plantation. What is a plantation? And we came up with two quite different definitions. For Pujo, quote, a plantation is a giant, an inefficient and lazy giant, but still a giant. It takes up a huge amount of space. It is greedy and careless, destroying everything around. It is alien, strange, and unpredictable. It is human, but you cannot form a normal human relationship with it. It can trample you, eat you, or drain your strength, then spit you out. It guards its treasure. You cannot tame it or make it go away. You have to live with it, but it's a bit stupid. So if you are clever, you can steal from it. My definition went like this. A plantation is a machine that assembles land, labor, and capital in huge quantities to produce monocrops for world markets. It is intrinsically colonial, based on the assumption that the people on the spot are incapable of inefficient production. It takes life under control. Space, time, flora, fauna, water, chemicals, people. It is owned by a corporation and run by managers along bureaucratic lines. So those two definitions form the core, really, of the analytical framework which we eventually developed to try to make sense of the plantation life that we found in our research. Already in Indonesia, around 15 million people live a plantation life. They live either as workers on plantations or worker families, or they live in the nook and cranny spaces between plantations, which I showed in the previous, on some previous pictures. So in these landscapes, the giants are firmly installed and they do all the things that Pujo says they do. They monopolize space, they use people's strengths, then toss them out like old rags. So when a giant moves into your neighborhood, you have to live with it. This is the character. Going to my definition, what makes a plantation, first of all, intrinsically colonial? One part of this has to do with what the historian Syed Hussein Alatas called the myth of the lazy native. This is the idea that native producers are incapable of efficient production of world market crops, and therefore their land is underutilized, and even as workers, they're not much good, they lack discipline. So this kind of colonial myth, the myth of the lazy native, licensed plantation expansion in colonial times. It was the reason why, or at least the alibi for the arrival of large-scale plantations in Indonesia and elsewhere. It was the reason why land could be expropriated and labor could be imported. So we argue that this colonial aspect, the myth of the lazy native, is still intact and absolutely entrenched in the plantation format today. Everywhere you see plantations in Indonesia and globally, you see some version of this idea that the natives on the spot are not efficient producers and therefore corporations must replace them. So a second element then of this way of thinking is to consider plantations as a kind of race-making machine. If you look at that, if you consider that based on the myth of the lazy native, plantations are presented as centers of technical expertise, order, productivity, and modernity. So intrinsically then, they produce racial others as their negative image. They can constitute hierarchies and profound separations, even when, as in Indonesia, this is not usually called racial. So what this means is that if a plantation is the center of modernity, the people outside it, the people who live in the nooks and cranny spaces around plantations, the people not employed as workers, must be others, and in particular, deficient others. people who are backward and are not suitable for the modern life that a plantation symbolizes. So this then, this question of race and plantations as race-making machines was one part of the analytical framework we devised to make sense of what we found, and also to understand the new economic, political, and social relations that plantations install. That's to say, it's not that there were racial differences and then came the plantations. The plantations actually produce what became entrenched, hierarchical, deep social divides of a race-like character. Another term that we, or really the core term I would say that we came up with to make sense of the plantation format is the idea of corporate occupation. So we did not start with this notion. When I was reading through my own field notes, I realized that in the margins of my notes, I had written, these people are at war. This is a war zone. Something violent is taking place here. But war really wasn't a good term for it because the violence was not direct. There were no guns. There was no, the police for the most part were not armed. It wasn't a violence of a military kind. Nevertheless, the way that people were living, we came to recognize, really had the characteristic of living under occupation. That's to say that every aspect of the lives of people in a plantation zone, whether they are plantation workers living inside plantation concessions or the original population of the area, in the case of our research, these are Malay and Dayak people who used to live on this land and who are still there living in nook and cranny spaces in between plantations. All of them, one could say, are living under occupation. Although a key aspect of occupation is that it can be spatially differentiated. So the way that plantation workers are occupied is different from the way that contracted outgrowers are occupied, and different again from the way that people living around the plantations are occupied. But this idea of occupation helped us to make sense of the new set of legal and political practices which we saw in our research area. So one of the features of occupation then is collaboration and complicity. So all of the officials in and around a plantation zone are officially tasked with smoothing the path of the plantations. It is their job to make sure that the corporations get official support when they run into trouble or for routine matters. So a plantation zone is one in which government officials and politicians are collaborators of the plantation. And the local population, workers and everyone else, in some way become complicit, in the sense that if you cannot make the giant go away, you have to live with it. And that means finding ways to attempt to survive and sometimes to profit through whatever means are available. So this is a common finding in occupation zones, that they produce new social and political relations of collaboration and complicity. Why then are plantations expanding today? This is a question we felt was necessary to address. On the one hand, the colonial premise, the racialized myth of the lazy native, is still in play, not just in Indonesia, but globally. The World Bank and others have produced maps of what they call underutilized land worldwide, in which the natives on the spot, whoever they are, in Africa, Latin America, or across Asia, are apparently inefficient and incompetent producers who should be replaced by large-scale corporate plantations and other similar formats. So that's one reason why plantation format is present and in fact expanding. One argument that corporations use is that they produce efficiently and therefore they're more capable of meeting the needs of growing global populations. They sometimes also argue that they are land sparing in some way, in that if you produce efficiently on a smaller area of land, more areas of forest and grassland and so on can be set aside for conservation and for mitigation of climate change, though I think one could really debate that argument. And there's also a common global rhetoric which has been around really for the last 30 years, the entire neoliberal period, which suggests that our partners in the private sector are the proper entities to bring development to rural areas. So this argument is certainly entrenched currently in Indonesia, where the government has opened the door very wide for investors in order to create jobs and develop remote areas. So that is the reason why, or at least that's the alibi for the expansion of corporations today. So what then is the harm? On the one hand, for more than 20 years, critics in Indonesia and elsewhere have been pointing out many rather obvious harms: forest loss, the ecological risks of monocropping, species loss, climate change risk. To have so much land under a single crop under conditions of climate uncertainty is very risky, and also market risk. These kinds of critiques are well known. There is also the issue of corporate monopoly over land, the way it squeezes out diverse livelihoods and small-scale farms and infringes customary land rights and customary institutions. So these are harms for sure, and they are also very well known, right? For 20 years, critics have been pointing these out. The labor conditions on the plantations have been actually deteriorating, I would say, over the last 20, 30 years. There was a time when to be employed on one of Indonesia's state plantations in the 1980s, for example, was a good job. These were good jobs with with reasonable pay, with pension, health provision, housing. The plantation in our study site, the state plantation, imported migrant workers from Java, and most of them stayed until retirement because these were indeed good jobs. Both husband and wife were employed, and they did not feel that they were, they felt that they had done well in joining the labor scheme. But those conditions have deteriorated since plantation work is increasingly casualized and outsourced. Again, those problems of labor are very well known and well researched. Many people have pointed them out. Nevertheless, plantations expand, right? So the harms are well known. And one of our arguments is that these are, in fact, licensed harms, that they're no surprise and they're no accident. They are legitimated by the argument that plantations bring wealth to the country, produce goods for global markets, and also bring development and jobs to remote areas. So based on the purported benefits, the harms, which are well known, are licensed or legitimated or understood to be less serious than the benefits, right? That's the kind of equation which is going on here. One further element which I think we have really emphasized, and which I don't think does figure as much in previous studies, including critical studies, is this question of occupation and the way that people's legal standing, their capacity to exert the rights that they have as citizens is very much diminished in a plantation zone because of the way that government officials become collaborators and the immovability of the plantation, the fact that it won't go away, you have to live with it. So in all of these ways, rural people who live in plantation zones do not have the rights, the effective rights and capacities of other rural citizens. They do live under a kind of corporate occupation, which leaves them extremely vulnerable. There's no point in going to complain to the district head or the sub-district head that your land has been taken or your rubber trees destroyed or your water has been polluted by effluent from the mill, because these are the anticipated and expected and in fact licensed harms which are known to occur and which you as the occupied population are obliged to somehow tolerate. So that, I think, is one contribution that we have made here in understanding really the depth of the transformation that corporate occupation produces. It's not just a question of the land of the concession, but the entire zone, which now falls under this kind of differentiated occupation regime. The question then arises, what's the fix? You know, is there any solution to this? So many people, again, have worked on this notion that, yes, there are harms, but they can be addressed, they can be ameliorated. The Royal Roundtable of Sustainable Oil Palm has worked along these lines for a couple of decades now, actually ran a campaign called Good Oil, Bad Oil, which acknowledged that there are bad things happen, there are irresponsible corporations, but with the correct measures in place, bad oil can become good. So basically there's no intrinsic harm, there are simply bad actors, bad corporations, bad practices, all of which can be corrected. So that is an argument which we very much dispute. And I think it's because of our ethnographic finding of the depth of transformation and the nature of transformation that occurs when you live as an occupied population, and also the notion of licensed harms. None of these measures for corporate social responsibility actually reverse the practice and the process of occupation. For the most part, they enable it because they suggest that it can be done in a better way. And so somehow the harms can be eliminated or much reduced. But at the end of the day, corporations, however virtuous they attempt to be, are still giants. They still take up a huge amount of space. You know, recall all the red areas on the map I showed in my other presentation. And they are immovable and they are heavily protected, far more heavily protected than the people who live in and around them. So these, we argue, are harms which really cannot be ameliorated. And that is the character of plantation life in Indonesia today. So any argument that win-win solutions can be devised, act in different ways as a mode of entrenching the corporate model. So an argument I'm not going to make in detail now, but we do make in the book, is that this whole feature of corporate occupation, the occupation of massive areas of land by corporations, is in fact unnecessary, because Indonesian farmers for more than 3 centuries have been eager, enthusiastic, and highly competent farmers, including farmers of global market crops. Since 1700s, they've produced coffee, cocoa, rubber, tobacco, currently palm oil, efficiently and enthusiastically when given access to good planting material and the relevant infrastructure. So it would actually be possible for Indonesia still to produce a very large amount of palm oil, but to do so in ways which do not involve corporate occupation and all of the harms which follow from it. So there is an alternative, and that alternative is not to make the corporations good, but in fact to investigate and be serious about non-corporate models, or models in which the corporations would not be farmers scattered throughout the interior, displacing all of the local landholders and squeezing them into tiny enclaves, but in fact, you know, taking on a different kind of partnership role, which would be very much less harmful. So those are some of the main arguments of the book. We hope you will enjoy reading it, and I'll leave it there. Thank you.